So let's talk about NASCAR and the approved history, because a lot of people may know about Bill France, right? And the fact that Southerners approve of anything that's French is really crazy to me. But Bill France is the guy who takes most of the credit. But he is not the focus of Driving with the Devil.
Dang it, he is not, no. I mean, he does get credit to this day, and as I mentioned, his family still owns the sport, which I found remarkable when I started the research. I mean, it's like somebody owning Major League Baseball or the NBA.
How filthy rich is that family?
Oh, they got some money.
Yeah.
I mean, they have traditionally been, he and his, well, he's passed away, and his son, I don't know if his son's still alive. So there's Bill Sr., Bill Jr., and now there's Brian France, who's the president of NASCAR. And all of them were among the richest people in America in recent years. So Bill France was a racer in the late 1930s and into the 40s. He was friends with the Moonshiners, but he wasn't allegedly one himself. But he would run into them on the stock car racing circuit throughout the South. He ended up in Daytona Beach. The story goes that he was in Washington, D.C., where he grew up, too cold, wanted to get someplace else and start a garage of his own, and ended up driving south and broke down in Daytona and found a garage there, and he settled there. So in the book, I describe how there were kind of maybe 2.5 birthplaces of NASCAR. One is Daytona Beach, because Bill France in the late 1930s started sponsoring races there, where they would, like the first Daytona 500 races were down Highway A1A, left turn through the sand dunes, up the beach, you know, where these guys would ride right next to the water and sometimes flip into the surf. Another left turn back onto A1A. So those were some of the first Daytona 500 races. But then in Atlanta, you've got the Moonshiners. And in my book, I really focus on that area as being what I consider the real birthplace of NASCAR, because that's where you've got these Moonshiners racing on the weekends, creating at first sort of an informal circuit, and then there are some connections that they make to other informal circuits. But they're really through the 30s and into the 40s. There aren't any real bylaws. There aren't any standards that anybody follows. It's you know, totally made up and a total bootstrap sport. There would be times where the promoter would promise whatever, $100 for a victory, and then by the time the race is over, he's gone, because he didn't make enough money from ticket sales or whatever. So it's a pretty rugged, ragged sport. Bill France is the one who tried to bring some legitimacy to the sport and bring some rules and consistency, and he did do that. I mean, in the book, I give him credit for being the one who pulled together this wild bunch of guys who mainly cared about racing and not about rules, and said, at what's now known as a historic meeting in 1947, brought a bunch of the promoters and racers together in Daytona and said, let's come up with some rules. Let's create something that can be the umbrella organization for this sport. That's what became the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing in 1948. Bill France, because nobody else wanted to deal with the paperwork, named himself for the first president. Over the next few years, took over from his two partners and ended up owning the whole damn thing. And his family does to this day.
That's impressive. And in those bylaws, was one of them no right turns? Was that never going to happen?
Yeah, that was required, right?
Just as a change of a change-up or something like that?
Well,
why? And what I don't get is, I like the history, I understand that, but it's a sport where all we're doing, and I understand there's a skill to it.
Right.
But
it's hard to see what the skill is.
It's driving fast and turning left.
It's one big left turn. That's what the joke is, yeah. And you know, to this day, I don't really understand it myself. I love the history of it. I love the characters. I love the role that this stuff played in it. But when I watch it today on a Sunday, I don't entirely get it either. I think part of the appeal goes back to the history of the South. And in the book, I show how they didn't have any professional sports teams. The Atlanta Braves, I think, were the first pro team, and they didn't move to Atlanta until 1965. So during this era that I write about, 30s, 40s, and into the early 50s, what did they have as far as big spectator sports? You had high school football, some college football. When these races came around, they were a big deal. And they became, pretty early on, the kind of 3 or 4 or 5 day celebration that you still got today at NASCAR races, where, you know, if you lived in rural Georgia or even Alabama and you heard about the big race at Lakewood Speedway next month outside of Atlanta, you'd plan days ahead and you'd caravan there with all your buddies and you'd stay a week maybe. So these were not just about the race itself, it was about the spectacle of it. And in the early days,
and the community of it.
The community of it, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that idea that this was our sport. Right. The rest of the world might not understand it, maybe all the better, because it's ours. And that's why it's always had this reputation that it tries to get away from sometimes as being the hillbilly sport, the redneck sport. And I think, on the one hand, they'll never get away from that. If you go to any race, and I've been to a few, you'll see the Confederate flags everywhere, and it's not a sport that's all that popular among minorities. You know, I went to one race with my kids, and they were commenting on the lack of faces of color at a NASCAR race, and I don't think that's going to change a whole lot, despite NASCAR's efforts to try and change that. At the same time, they want to keep those redneck fans, because that's their core base.
He said it, not me.
Yeah. And I think that's a tricky issue for them.
But it's not just rednecks. I mean, you don't get to 75 million. I mean, I think that's one of the great misnomers at this point. It's not just Southern, conservative Christian Republicans, which I think is a lot of people like to sort of label them that way, if not hillbillies.
Right.
But 75 million, that's a lot of people.
It is, and it's nationwide. So you're absolutely right. It's not just that. I would call those folks the core fan base. And then beyond that, I think that's what surprised a lot of people as they saw the sport grow in the past, let's call it 20 years, you yourself included, is that it became a sport of America for a variety of reasons. And I found it remarkable that the sport that was grown of this stuff and of the South is very comfortably at home in Las Vegas and Chicago and Southern California and Michigan and all these other homes that it's got now, where it's got a huge fan base. I mean, they tried to even build a track in New York and fell through, but no, I think it's popular everywhere, and it's not just because it's a Southern hillbilly sport.
But there are a lot of sports that I can watch that I don't fully understand, whether it's World Cup soccer or lacrosse or lingerie football. I can watch any of those things and get some enjoyment.
Where do you see lingerie football?
Right here, the Seattle Mist, playing up in Everett this week.
Okay.
Haven't actually seen it, but I can get behind the idea of it. But I just want to understand NASCAR. I want to understand racing, and so, I don't get it. I don't understand when I watch. I've tried watching on television. I watch the cars zipping around the track, and while I do love a good crash, I don't understand the point otherwise.
That part I'm not sure I can answer for you.
Really?
Yeah, I mean,
it seems so dehumanized. I can't. The NFL talked about if you could see the players' faces and getting the players out there, you'd relate more. And I just don't see enough of the drivers to actually care about the drivers.
But I think the fans do know who their drivers are,
right.
and that's who they align themselves with. It's a certain driver for a certain reason.
Right.
Dale Earnhardt, I read a great story in the New York Times Magazine a few weeks ago about Dale, who has not been a very successful racer. Right. In his father's shadow. His dad died in 2001. And he remains one of the most popular racers in NASCAR, even though he's sort of a mediocre racer. I think part of that is because he represents sort of this rebel attitude that the sport likes to think that they continue to portray. So fans will align themselves with a guy like that, or Tony Stewart because he gets in fights with other racers. Right. So it's kind of a celebrity-driven sport in a lot of ways. You pick your racer based on their personality, and that's who you stick with. And then all you care about when you're watching the race is your guy, or you're rooting for everybody else to crash.
Right.
But
that actually seems very American somehow.
Right. Screw the other guy.
That's right. But when his dad died, that was big stuff.
That was big stuff.
It seemed almost equal to Michael Jackson's passing.
It was kind of not a wake-up call, but a realization for a lot of folks that, holy crap, this thing is huge.
Right.
Because it was front page news for days and days. People were, weeping and pulling their hair out. People were just so upset that this guy died. Right. And I think that's when mainstream media started to pay a little bit more attention. I mean, at that time, I don't think for example, New York Times had a full-time NASCAR driver. Now you see it covered on a regular basis in the New York Times and all the mainstream
Not a driver,
media.
but a reporter. Right?
A reporter, yeah.
Yes. I don't see a NASCAR car branded with the New York Times for some reason taking off.
Not yet. If newspapers keep going in this direction, though, maybe you will.
So are there any like books or movies other than your own? Because Driving with the Devil, absolutely fantastic.
Thanks.
Other than yours, are there any that you could recommend?
Movies, there's the classic Thunder Road with Robert Mitchum, which sort of shows that world of running moonshine and being rebellious. I guess I was surprised when I started working on my book that there wasn't a whole lot out there that explored this part of the sport's history. A lot of the books that I relied on for research, celebrity-driven. I mean, it was a profile of a certain racer. Most of them focused on racers who came from, have been around since 1950 and forward. But the period I cover, 40s and 30s, there really wasn't a whole lot out there. I tried to steep myself in some Southern literature to get an understanding of the mindset of the folks I was writing about in that era. But I was shocked that there wasn't a whole lot out there that showed the early history of this sport in its most colorful period. Right. You could look at any other sport and find plenty of books about the early days. But I think that's lacking with NASCAR.
It is, and I mean, your story is such a good one. It seems dying for a Hollywood adaptation. Have you sold those rights yet?
I've optioned them a couple times, and they've sort of lingered and fallen through and lingered. So there's a producer in New York who's interested in doing a series, and we'll see. I mean, I think it'd be a great story, and there are great characters, one of whom, by the way, just died. One of the main characters in the book is this moonshiner, Raymond Parks.
Ray Parks,
who's just a classic character who left home at 14 to become a moonshiner, made a ton of money doing it in Atlanta, and got out of the sport pretty early on. He left in 1950, having been one of the real pioneers of the sport and a financial benefactor as well, and just kind of walked away when it started to get off the ground a little bit. He just passed away earlier this summer.
Ray Parks and Red Boat and Red
Byron.
Red Byron, all great, colorful characters.
Yeah.
What's a better NASCAR movie, Days of Thunder or Talladega Nights?
Absolutely Talladega Nights.
Talladega Nights, because Tom Cruise just is incredible, is he?
No, but who's the other guy? Ricky Bobby?
Ricky Bobby.
He's credible.
He's credible. He would fit in with the Moonshiners?
I think so, yeah.
Wow, can we take another
I think we
sip
should.
of this?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So, I want to watch NASCAR. I want to understand. What is your one tip for me and viewers out there who haven't embraced the sport yet? What can we do to other than drinking this?
Well,
what can we do to really enjoy it?
This is it. You're doing it. This maybe a couple PBRs,
and just
relax in front of the TV and just get lost in it.
There's not one little thing to tell me about watching this that it doesn't just seem like a blur of sponsored cars going by?
You could pay attention to what's happening in pit row.
Okay.
Getting in and out of there quickly is I don't know if you call it an art form, but in that world it is. I've gone to schools where they teach you how to do that in North Carolina. So that's part of the expertise is getting in and out of the pits fast. Drafting is another technique, where they hang behind one of the drivers and then try and whip themselves around. But it's real subtle stuff. I think you'd have to spend time really watching a few races to get some of the nuances, because it is all nuance. Right. Other than that, fastest guy wins. But between the beginning of the race and the fastest guy winning is 3 hours of left turn. So I don't know. I think maybe you try this first.
I will try that again. I will promise to try to watch NASCAR again and appreciate it for all its nuance, but I would sooner see Seattle Lights actually maneuver through a four-way stop. Just my take on it. So,
good luck with that.
That's good driving. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
I honestly do like this. This is pretty good.
You want a little to go?
Oh, I can't. No, it's part of your collection, isn't it? I'll take a little sip. How about a little shoot?